The summer of 1966 was supposed to be NASCAR's season of triumph. The sport had come through a bruising confrontation with Chrysler the year before, when the automaker pulled its factories and its star drivers from competition over the banning of the 426 Hemi engine. That boycott had been devastating. Without Richard Petty, without the legendary drivers and the machines they commanded, trackside attendance plummeted. Promoters watched their dreams die in half-filled grandstands. Bill France Sr., the iron-fisted founder of NASCAR, had weathered that storm. He'd made peace with Chrysler. He'd allowed the Hemi back on the track. Sort of. The fans returned. Order was restored. But then Ford did the unthinkable. They made the same move. They walked away too. In early 1966, NASCAR had made a technical ruling. Ford's new overhead cam 427 cubic inch engine, the Cammer, was not a readily available production engine and therefore illegal under stock car racing rules. The decision made sense on paper. This engine was far more powerful than anything Chrysler or General Motors could field at the time. It was a technological leap that threatened to break the competition wide open. But Ford saw it differently. They argued that if they could show success in racing, production would follow. The market would demand it. NASCAR wasn't interested in that argument. The Cammer was banned. Period. Ford's response was swift and devastating to the sport. The factory teams withdrew. The defending Grand National champion Ned Jarrett went on the sidelines. The movie star handsome Fred Lorenzen, the golden boy himself, was benched. Curtis Turner, just returning from a 4-year ban, went back to the garage. The Firestone Dodge and Plymouth competitors suddenly had no one to beat, and the racing became one-sided and predictable. But worse than that, far worse, attendance at the tracks began to collapse all over again. For Bill France, this was a nightmare scenario. He had barely survived one manufacturer's boycott. His reputation as the absolute authority on NASCAR rules was already under assault. If he had to give in again, if the fans saw that Detroit could simply take its ball and go home whenever it pleased, the sport's credibility might never recover. But if he stood firm and attendance continued to crater, well, there might not be a sport left to worry about credibility. So France found himself in an impossible position, caught between principle and survival, between the letter of the law and the practical requirements of keeping the business alive. Somewhere around the middle of that summer, word began to circulate through the racing paddock. It was an invitation wrapped in the faintest of winks. If a certain car owner, someone willing to take risks, someone with the engineering genius to make something happen, were to show up in Atlanta in August with a Ford, NASCAR officials might be willing to bend some rules. Not break them, bend them. Just a little, just enough, just for one race, just to bring the fans back. This message found its way to a man named Junior Johnson, and Big Bill France would come to regret that moment for the rest of his life. Junior Johnson was not like other men in motorsports. Robert Glenn Johnson, Jr., born and raised in Ronda, North Carolina, had built his legend on two irrefutable foundations: raw speed and unbending determination to win by any means necessary. As a driver, he had thrilled crowds and terrified competitors. As an owner and engineer, he was becoming a visionary, a man who understood not just how to make a car go fast, but how to make it go faster than anyone thought possible by thinking in ways that the rulebook hadn't anticipated. In his early years as a driver, Junior had competed in everything from short tracks to the Grand National circuit. He'd proven himself competitive against the best in the sport, but what truly set him apart was his mechanical mind. He wasn't content to accept the designs and specifications that came off the assembly line at Ford, Chevrolet, or Chrysler. He looked at a car and saw possibilities, angles that hadn't been exploited, weights that could be redistributed, curves that could be optimized. He saw the future of racing not in more horsepower alone, but in thinking three-dimensionally about how a machine could move through space. By 1965, Junior had transitioned from full-time driving to team ownership, fielding the number 26 Ford as owner-driver. But the 1966 season had taken that opportunity away when the Cammer engine was banned. Like other car owners, Junior had been left on the sidelines, watching from the garage as opportunity and revenue evaporated. When word came that he might be allowed to return for the Atlanta race in August, with certain understandings about what officials might overlook, Junior didn't hesitate. This was not an invitation to make a slightly faster car or to squeeze out a few more horsepower through clever carburetor tuning. This was an invitation to think big. This was an invitation to do exactly what Junior Johnson had spent his entire career doing, finding the edges of the rulebook and dancing along them. Ford Motor Company was desperate enough to back him. In fact, unconfirmed reports suggest that Ford headquarters in Detroit was quietly funding this operation, providing under-the-table support to get their star driver Fred Lorenzen back on the track. The money was real. The commitment was real. And most importantly, the understanding was real. Big Bill France had made a deal with the devil, and Junior Johnson was ready to collect. The engineer set to work designing not just a fast car, but a car that would be so radically different from stock specifications that it would make every other competitor on that track look positively conventional by comparison. What he created would become the stuff of NASCAR legend, and legend often rhymes with infamy. The 1966 Ford Galaxie that Junior Johnson prepared for Fred Lorenzen was not, strictly speaking, a 1966 Ford Galaxie. It was a sculpture masquerading as a stock car. It was a rolling middle finger to the NASCAR rulebook, and from the moment it rolled into Atlanta International Raceway, everyone in the paddock knew it. The modifications began at the nose. Junior shortened and lowered the front clip, angling the hood downward in a way that no production Ford Galaxie had ever been designed. This wasn't just for show. The downward angle reduced the frontal area, presenting air resistance and improved aerodynamic flow. The windshield was laid back at an angle of at least 20 degrees, a radical departure from stock specifications. The roofline itself was chopped, reduced by somewhere between 2 and 5 inches, though accounts varied depending on who was telling the story and how many beers they'd had. What made this modification particularly audacious was that it wasn't done symmetrically. The left side of the roof was lowered more than the right, creating an uneven profile that was visible from 20 feet away. The sides of the car were narrowed. The side windows were reduced to slots, barely wide enough for a driver to squeeze through. The suspension was lowered until the chassis sat so close to the ground that journalists covering the race would later report that drivers had to be physically lifted into the driver's seat and slid horizontally through the window opening. Fred Lorenzen, the handsome athletic golden boy, had to be maneuvered into his cockpit like cargo being loaded into a cargo plane. But the most distinctive modification was what gave the car its immortal nickname. The rear quarter panels and trunk lid were swept upward and curved in a way that created a distinctive hump over the rear wheels. When viewed from the side, the entire car seemed to curve upward at the tail, creating a profile that looked exactly like what you might imagine a banana would look like if you stretched it and painted it in brilliant Ford yellow. Journalists at the track instantly christened it the Yellow Banana. Competitors had other, less charitable names. Junior's joke, the magna-fluxed monster. But the name that stuck, the name that would echo through 50 years of NASCAR history, was the Yellow Banana. The purpose of every modification was the same: to reduce weight, decrease wind resistance, generate downforce, and create an aerodynamic package that was so far ahead of its time that competing in a conventional car was like bringing a horse to a sports car race. The Yellow Banana wasn't just faster, it was faster in a way that seemed to violate the very spirit of stock car racing, which was supposed to feature cars that resembled what fans could buy at their local dealer. When the Yellow Banana rolled through the technical inspection line, everyone held their breath. This was the moment when NASCAR officials would take one look at this absurdity, shake their heads, and send it back to the garage. This was the moment when the rules would be enforced, when principle would triumph, when the sport's integrity would be preserved. It was not that moment. The Yellow Banana passed inspection. The officials looked at Junior Johnson's creation, made a mental note about the backroom deal they'd made with Big Bill France, and waved it through. It was legal. It was cleared to race. It was ready. Fred Lorenzen, squeezed into that tiny cockpit like a pilot in an ejection seat, took the yellow banana out for qualifying and ran third on the speed charts. He was fast. He was smooth. He was ready. What nobody could have predicted was what would happen when the race actually started. The August 7th, 1966 race at Atlanta Motor Speedway was supposed to be a simple affair. Fred Lorenzen would run the yellow banana, finish respectably, and prove that Ford still had a place in NASCAR racing. The factory teams would return, attendance would rebound, everyone would move on. That was the plan, that was the understanding, that was the deal. It didn't work out that way because this was NASCAR in 1966, and the 1966 Atlanta race turned out to be perhaps the most beautifully chaotic, rule-bending, anything-goes weekend in the entire history of stock car racing. It wasn't just the yellow banana pushing the boundaries, it was everyone. Curtis Turner, a legendary driver just returning to the sport after his ban, showed up in a Chevrolet Chevelle prepared by none other than Smokey Yunick, the most legendary rules bender in NASCAR history. Smokey's Chevelle was even more outrageous than the yellow banana in some ways. The car was allegedly built to approximately 7/8 scale relative to its stock counterpart. It was smaller, it was lighter, it carried an oversized engine. Reports suggest it was about 20 cubic inches over the legal limit, and Smokey hadn't stopped there. The car featured a built-in roof spoiler years before spoilers became standard equipment. The frame was offset to one side. The drip rails on the roof were completely removed. Every possible advantage that Smokey could engineer into that car without actually breaking something important had been implemented. Curtis Turner took the pole position in Smokey's Chevelle, which should have been proof that something illegal was going on. But everyone saw what was happening and decided to play along, more or less. David Pearson, the defending champion and one of the best drivers in NASCAR, was behind the wheel of a Dodge Charger owned by Cotton Owens. Pearson and his team looked at the yellow banana and the Chevelle and realized what was happening. If everyone else was bending the rules, why shouldn't they? Cotton Owens came up with an innovation. He designed a suspension system with 4 springs that could compress and literally drop the entire car by 3 inches when the driver activated it, lowering the chassis and improving aerodynamics mid-race. It was pure brilliance. It was completely illegal. And on Sunday morning, just hours before the race was set to start, NASCAR officials discovered it. They went to Cotton Owens with a simple message. You cannot run this car with that suspension system. You must use regular springs. Cotton Owens refused. He knew that Pearson couldn't compete with the yellow banana and the Chevelle running conventional suspensions. The race would be a foregone conclusion. So Owens made a decision. If he couldn't run the car the way they wanted to run it, they wouldn't run it at all. Cotton pulled David Pearson's Dodge out of the race entirely. The defending champion, the points leader, the man most likely to win under normal circumstances, was benched by his own team owner because the rules had been bent just far enough that playing the game by Junior's rules was impossible. So on that August afternoon, the most competitive race at Atlanta Motor Speedway in 1966 featured a yellow banana that probably shouldn't have been legal, a Chevelle that was definitely not legal, and an empty pit stall where the defending champion's Dodge should have been. Lorenzen in the yellow banana took the green flag, and the race began. What happened next would be talked about for decades. Fred Lorenzen had spent the first several months of 1966 on the sidelines, watching other drivers rack up victories and prize money while he cooled his heels, waiting for Ford to resolve its dispute with NASCAR. He'd been the golden boy for years, handsome, charming, skilled, and successful. But speed waits for no one, and after 4 months without racing, there was a very real question about whether Lorenzen could get back to his winning ways or if the layoff had cost him his edge. That question was answered almost immediately when the green flag dropped. Lorenzen drove that yellow banana like he'd never been away. The aerodynamic advantages that Junior Johnson had engineered into the car, the lowered profile, the angled windshield, the curved rear end, the reduced frontal area, all of it came together to create a machine that was simply faster than anything else on the track. Lorenzen pushed hard, drove smart, and began moving forward through the field with the kind of precision and control that only comes from a driver who knows he has the best equipment and isn't afraid to use it. For much of the race, he was engaged in a battle with Curtis Turner in Smokey's Chevelle. The two cars, each illegal in different ways, each breaking rules in different fashions, were clearly the dominant machines on the track. And then, on lap 139, it all came to an end. The reports were conflicting. Some sources said it was a tire failure. Others claimed it was a wheel hub that finally gave way under the tremendous stresses generated by a car that was pushing the boundaries of what 1966 technology could withstand. Whatever the cause, something broke. The yellow banana suddenly lost control at high speed, approximately 150 miles per hour, and Lorenzen sent the car hard into the wall. And somewhere in the pits or in the grandstands, a rival crew member watched the yellow car disappear into the barrier, watched the crash unfold, and uttered words that would become immortal in NASCAR history. "No wonder," the crew member said, shaking his head. "I ain't never seen somebody drive a banana at 150 miles per hour." It wasn't meant as a compliment, it was meant as an explanation. Of course the car crashed. You can't drive something that aerodynamically unstable at 150 miles per hour and expect it to hold together. You can't push the boundaries of physics and engineering that hard and expect the laws of nature to cooperate. The yellow banana had run its race. The crash was less of a surprise and more of an inevitability, the ultimate consequence of taking an already too far concept and taking it even further. Richard Petty, driving a more conventional and therefore more predictable Plymouth, went on to win the race. It was fitting. Petty represented continuity and stability, tradition and stock car racing as it was supposed to be. Lorenzen, sitting in the wreckage of the yellow banana, represented chaos and innovation, risk, and the willingness to go too far in pursuit of victory. The yellow banana had raced for one day. It had been dominant while it lasted. And then it was gone. The week following the Atlanta race, something remarkable happened. Big Bill France quietly made the announcement that the yellow banana would not race again. The car had served its purpose. Ford had been convinced to return to NASCAR. The factory teams would be back on the track. The fans could return to the grandstands. The crisis had been resolved. Within days, the factory Ford teams did indeed return. By mid-August 1966, Fred Lorenzen was back behind the wheel of a conventional Ford. Nothing chopped, nothing curved, nothing shaped like fruit. The boycott was over. Ford's return to competition allowed NASCAR to show that the sport could maintain its authority while also being flexible enough to keep the manufacturers happy. It was the best of both worlds. It was also, from a regulatory standpoint, a complete disaster. The problem was that the yellow banana had proven a fundamental truth. If you allowed one car owner to bend the rules enough, if you allowed one genius engineer to push the boundaries far enough, the resulting competitive advantage was so enormous that the sport itself would be compromised. Fair competition becomes impossible. The carefully cultivated illusion of stock car racing, that these are supposed to be stock cars, becomes laughable. So when the 1967 season began, NASCAR was ready with a solution. For the first time in the sport's history, NASCAR officials arrived at each racetrack with templates, physical measurements of what a legal race car was supposed to look like. Body dimensions were standardized: roof heights, hood shapes, window placements, bumper locations. All of it was measured and verified before each car was allowed on the track. The age of unlimited creativity was over. The era of Junior Johnson and Smokey Yunick freely interpreting the rulebook was finished. The sport had grown up, and with that growth had come regulation. But here's where the story takes an ironic turn. The rule changes that NASCAR implemented in 1967, designed to prevent cars like the yellow banana from ever existing again, didn't shut down aerodynamic innovation. They just channeled it differently. The manufacturers, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, took the concept of what Junior Johnson and Smokey Yunick had pioneered and did it properly, with corporate resources and engineering departments. By the end of the 1960s, NASCAR had the Torino Talladega with its extreme nose treatment and functional aerodynamic design. It had the Charger Daytona with its towering rear wing and aggressive aerodynamic package. It had the Plymouth Superbird, one of the most iconic race cars ever built, with its radical nose and adjustable rear wing. These cars took everything that Junior Johnson had imagined with the yellow banana and amplified it, refined it, and made it legal. The difference was that now the manufacturers themselves were the rule breakers. Ford wasn't boycotting NASCAR anymore. Chrysler wasn't in conflict with Big Bill France. General Motors was all in on the aerodynamic wars. The manufacturers themselves became the drivers of innovation, the pushers of boundaries, the participants in what became known as the Aero Wars. And because they were manufacturers, because they represented the automotive industry itself, they had a seat at the table when the rules were written. They got to participate in the very definitions of what was legal and what wasn't. It was the logical conclusion of what had started with the yellow banana. Junior Johnson and Smokey Yunick had been geniuses operating outside the system, rebels who bent the rules because they were clever enough to do so. But their real legacy was showing the manufacturers that aerodynamics mattered, that shape and form, and the way a car moved through space could be just as important as what was under the hood. Once the manufacturers understood that lesson, they took it and ran with it, literally and figuratively, until the entire character of stock car racing was transformed. Fred Lorenzen would continue his career in NASCAR, but he would never drive anything quite as audacious as the yellow banana. Junior Johnson would go on to become one of the most successful team owners in NASCAR history, but he would do it with cars that looked like cars that obeyed the rule book, cars that didn't require their drivers to be physically lifted into the cockpit. And the yellow banana itself would become a relic of racing history, a one-race wonder, the most beautiful, the most outrageous, the most illegal, and most necessary rule breaker in NASCAR's history. That single race at Atlanta Motor Speedway on August 7, 1966, marked the end of an era. It was the last day that Big Bill France would look the other way. It was the last time a car so brazenly outside the rules would be allowed to compete. It was the last stand of the rule benders and the rule makers playing a game without clear rules. But it was also the beginning of something new. The yellow banana's one race proved that the future of stock car racing would be aerodynamic. It proved that shape and speed were inseparable. And it proved that sometimes the wildest innovations come not from careful planning and rule following, but from brilliant misfits willing to push absolutely everything to the breaking point, and then push it even further. When that yellow banana hit the wall on lap 139, it wasn't just a car crashing. It was the end of an era and the beginning of another. It was the last beautiful, illegal gasp of a sport learning to grow up. And it was the yellow banana's most important victory of all. It changed racing forever, not through victory, but through the consequences of its failure.